Hi friends, tonight let me take you on a quiet and wistful journey into the not-so-golden fields of Edwardian England. We often romanticize this period, the lace dresses, the horse-drawn carriages, the sprawling estates. But hidden in the hedgerows and behind the stone walls were lives far less gilded. This is the story of the farmers, the unseen, the overworked, and the barely getting by souls who coaxed life from the land and were slowly broken by it. We'll step softly into their world and feel the damp earth, the cold hearth, the relentless ticking of time. This is their tale. The morning light in Edwardian England arrived not with warmth, but with a bone-deep chill and the heavy scent of damp earth. The sky, a smear of pewter and pearl, gave no promise of sunshine. It was a time when the day did not begin with birdsong or breakfast. It began with duty. Far from the grandeur of London or the comfort of middle-class parlours, the countryside rolled out in tufts and hollows, fields stitched together by crumbling, hedgerows, paths worn by boots and hooves alike, and cottages that leaned slightly as if tired from the years. This was the home of the Edwardian farmer, or more accurately, the Edwardian agricultural labourer, for very few worked their own land. In a small village nestled within the folds of West Sussex, the farmer's son, Walter Tilling, awoke before the sky had even considered changing. His bed, little more than straw in a wooden frame, groaned as he shifted. The fire had gone out in the night. Frost laced the window glass. Walter was 14 and already older in spirit than many would live to be. His hands bore calluses that no child should have known, and his back had learned to curve slightly from early mornings bent over soil. His mother had died of pneumonia 2 winters past. His younger sister May coughed too often, and his father was like the land itself, steadfast, gruff, worn. The Tillings were tenant farmers, meaning they worked the land that belonged to another. In this case, Lord Ainsley, whose manor house perched smugly on a nearby hill. They owed him rent, yields, and obedience. Every inch of the field they ploughed was someone else's profit. Walter dressed in silence, a coarse woolen shirt, patched trousers, and boots that had once been his father's. In the kitchen, the kettle sat cold. The bread was yesterday's and already going stale. His father sat at the table with a tin cup of weak tea. They exchanged a nod. There were no morning greetings in this house, only the knowledge of what needed doing. They stepped outside into a world still swaddled in fog. The land was not quiet. There were bleats, caws, the occasional creak of a gate in the distance, but it felt heavy with stillness. There was no time to reflect, only to begin. The cows needed tending. The frost made their coats steam. The pigs grunted hungrily. The chickens, if they had laid at all, needed eggs gently collected lest they break and cost a penny's worth of nourishment. Walter moved from task to task without complaint, but never without noticing the growing hole in his gut. Hunger was a companion he'd learned not to speak of. While the labour was endless, the wages were not. Most agricultural workers earned a pittance, 10 to 12 shillings a week if they were lucky, and even that fluctuated based on weather, crop yield, and Lord Ainsley's temperament. There was no contract, no guarantee, only a tacit agreement: work or starve. By mid-morning, Walter had dirt beneath every fingernail and a sweat-soaked collar. His thoughts wandered briefly to the schoolhouse at the village's edge, where boys his age still learned to read. He could read, of course, barely. His mother had taught him before she fell ill. But letters had little use when the barley needed sowing. His father spoke little during the day, except to direct, "Southfield needs turning. Don't let that one bolt. Fox in the henhouse last night." His words came in grunts and shorthands. Emotion was a luxury. Sentiment was something for the gentry. As the sun crawled toward its reluctant peak, Walter stole a moment to sit by a fence post and drink from a tin flask of barley water. The horizon seemed endless, but he knew the boundaries well. Each hedge, and style marked a place they could not go without trespassing, on property or on someone else's future. He thought about London sometimes. The posters in the village shop showed gleaming trains and smartly dressed lads. But they also whispered of squalor, of factories that chewed boys up like grain into a thresher. There was no promise of better, just different, and difference was a risk they could not afford. Back at the cottage that evening, the fire was lit low. A stew of parsnips and scraps bubbled dully. His sister May's cough echoed down the narrow hallway. Their father stared into the fire like it owed him an answer. Walter, tired to the bone, sat by the window and looked out. The fog had returned, this time gilded faintly by moonlight. He thought of the fields, how they yielded little, how they drained so much. He wondered if life might change, if someday the land might be theirs. But hope was a dangerous thing to feed. In Edwardian England, farmers lived by the seasons but died by the day. Each sunrise was a test, each sunset a small mercy. And in the in-between, there was only labour, silence, and the distant, unreachable sound of prosperity in the manor on the hill. The dawn crept in softly, grey and damp, as though unsure if it was truly welcome. In the small thatched cottage nestled between hedgerows and frostbitten barley, Walter Tilling stirred once more beneath his coarse woolen blanket. Sleep had not claimed him easily, and it had not stayed long. There were too many thoughts, too many aches, and too many days that felt like the same unwritten page. He rose without ceremony. The fire had gone cold in the hearth, and the floor was icy against his bare feet. In the corner, a sack of oats lay almost empty, the last handful saved for May. His younger sister slept curled beneath a patchwork quilt, her breath wheezing, slightly. Her cough had lingered since Michaelmas. No doctor had come. In the kitchen, their father stood as he always did, silent, broad-shouldered, and unmoving, like a sculpture chiselled out of worry. A thin slice of bread sat on the table, flanked by a scraping of goose fat, and yesterday's tea leaves boiled again for warmth. They ate without speaking. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said the day before, and the day before. That. Outside, the wind tugged at the shutters and rustled the brittle leaves. It was late November, the cruelest time. The fields offered little, and the pantries less. The autumn harvest, such as it was, had come in sickly and stunted. The potatoes had turned black in the soil from blight. The barley was stunted and sour, and the few turnips they'd pulled were shriveled and soft. Walter and his father worked from sunup to near dark, repairing fencing, hauling manure, and mending the stone wall that divided Lord Ainsley's wheat fields from the tenant pasture. None of it was paid labour, it was simply expected. Rent was not a number scrawled on a page. It was an endless cycle of labour, deference, and quiet desperation. Fail to meet expectations, and you might find yourself without a roof come Candlemas. By mid-morning, Walter's hands were numb from digging. A cold wind had set in, cutting through his patched coat with ruthless ease. He paused only to rub warmth into his fingers, and then returned to his task. He thought of bread, warm, crusty, fresh from an oven. His mother used to bake, every Wednesday, but flour was expensive now, and they no longer kept a pig for lard. Their meals had dwindled to whatever root vegetables could be coaxed from the frost-hard ground. At noon, his father handed him a scrap of cheese wrapped in muslin and a dry heel of bread. "Eat slow," he said gruffly, not unkindly. "It's the last of it." They sat beneath a bare-branched tree, staring out at the skeletal hedgerows and sullen sky. Walter chewed slowly, watching the way the mist clung to the fields. In the distance, the spire of the village church pierced the fog like a warning finger. "Reckon there'll be soup at the hall come Sunday," his father muttered. "Charity from the vicar's wife. Maybe we'll go." Walter said nothing. He didn't like taking charity, though he understood it wasn't really a choice. Pride was a meal no one could digest. That evening, they returned home to find May curled on the hearth, her face pale, eyes wide. "I tried to make porridge," she whispered. "Used water and a little milk. It boiled over." Her father ruffled her hair gently and said nothing more. Walter stirred the pot, scraping what remained from the blackened bottom. They ate in silence once again. It was hot and thin, but it was something. After supper, Walter sat by the window, the panes fogged, with his breath. The manor house on the hill glowed faintly through the trees, its windows golden with lamplight and roaring hearths. Somewhere up there, fine people were eating roast meat and sugared fruit. Somewhere up there, life was warm and full. His father joined him after a while, settling into a worn chair. "They say they're bringing in machinery come spring," he said, voice low. "Lord Ainsley's ordered a steam thresher, says he'll only need half the men." Walter's heart dropped like a stone in a pond. Half the men. That meant half the wages, half the food, or none at all. "They think machines'll do what we do," his father went on. "Faster, cleaner, no fuss. But a machine doesn't feel the frost or know how a calf comes breech, doesn't see a storm in the soil." Walter nodded slowly. He wasn't afraid of work, but he was afraid of vanishing, of becoming obsolete before he'd even truly begun. Upstairs, May coughed again, a deep rattle that seemed to come from someplace much older than her 8 years. Walter stood and went to her, adjusting the blanket around her narrow shoulders. "Will we be all right?" she asked, eyes wide in the dim light. He hesitated, then softly, "We always are." It was not a promise. It was a ritual, a way of pretending the world could be kind. That night, Walter lay awake once more, listening to the sighing wind through the eaves. The darkness pressed in close, heavy with cold and silence. In Edwardian England, to be a farmer was to dance at the edge of ruin. You toiled not for comfort, but to delay collapse. You worked to eat, and you ate just enough to work. And still, the dawn would come. Always it came, and always they rose. The days rolled forward with the slow, grinding weight of a cart stuck in mire. One looked like the next. A patch of grey sky, a bowl of thin porridge, a boot caked in mud. And for Walter Tilling, barely into his 14th year, time had begun to feel less like a road and more like a circle, a rutted, creaking path walked over and over again. Winter had not yet reached its coldest cruelty, but the land was already sinking into itself. The fields were sodden, and the air carried the scent of something rotting beneath the surface. Vegetation, hope, maybe both. The ploughs had been tucked away, their iron dull and nicked. There would be no planting now, not until March, and even then only if the rains relented. For tenant farmers like the Tillings, winter was both a pause and a punishment. With little work to do in the fields, income slowed to a crawl, but the land still demanded, still soaked up time and effort and gave very little back. Walter spent hours mending everything. Harness straps frayed with use, buckets with hairline cracks, fences that had given way to the weight of wind and time. Their shed, which leaned slightly like a drunk at a sermon, was filled with broken things, tools mostly, and memories. On a Wednesday morning, Walter sat with a bent rake across his knees, trying to hammer the tines back into place with a stone and a rusty nail. His hands ached from cold, and every blow stung his fingertips. But he kept at it. His father entered the shed with the slow tread of someone who measured each step like a coin. "That one's nearly had it," he said, glancing at the rake. "We'll need to patch the scythe next. Spring will be here sooner than we think." Walter didn't answer. He simply nodded. The scythe, their best one, had a splinter running down its wooden shaft. If it broke mid-swing during the haying, it could take off a foot, or worse. In Edwardian England, there were no safety nets, not for tools, not for people. If something broke, you fixed it. If someone fell ill, you prayed. If the weather turned, you waited and hoped. And if none of that worked, you went hungry. The monotony of the season pressed down harder than the sky. Each day began with the same chores: the animals to feed, the water to haul, the hearth to stoke. And when those were done, there were nettles to be cleared, carts to be scrubbed, the privy to be shovelled. It was as if time itself needed constant maintenance just to keep moving forward. Sometimes, Walter dreamed of excitement, not joy or happiness, but simply something different, a festival, a market fair, even a storm, if it meant a change. But the village had long since quieted. The war in South Africa had ended a year before, and with it, the brief flicker of news and distraction. Now, the only headlines that reached them came on the lips of the curate or in the letters from distant cousins, often sealed with bad tidings and black ribbon. On Thursday, a man named Mr. Harker came by, offering to sell sharpening stones and lantern oil. He was a tinker, thin as wire, and dressed in 3 coats stitched together from different decades. He carried with him a kind of wildness, unpredictable, faintly unclean, and therefore faintly thrilling. Walter watched as his father bartered 2 eggs and a pewter spoon for a small grindstone. It was a lopsided trade, but one they needed. Sharp tools meant fewer accidents. Fewer accidents meant fewer lost days. When Mr. Harker left, Walter asked quietly, "Do you think he's lucky, going wherever he wants?" His father chewed on the thought like old leather. "Maybe, but he's got no land to answer to, no one to feed but himself." There was no condemnation in his voice, just observation. Still, Walter filed the thought away. The tinker was poor, but he moved, and there was power in that. That night, the wind rattled the shutters like an impatient ghost. The family huddled close to the hearth, the fire dancing low, barely enough to warm their feet. May clutched her ragdoll tightly, eyes fluttering with half-sleep. Their father told a story, not a fairy tale, but a memory, of his own father and the blizzard of 1879, of sheep frozen in the fields and the river turned to stone. He spoke not with drama, but with the grim reverence of a man who understood how close ruin always lurked. Walter listened, chin resting on his knees. The stories were few and far between, and when they came, he hoarded them like coins. Later, as they climbed into bed, Walter's thoughts drifted again, not toward hope exactly, but toward wondering if there might be a different kind of life waiting somewhere beyond the hedgerows and muddy lanes. One where every winter wasn't a test, and every day didn't begin and end with exhaustion, but dreams were indulgences, and Walter had learned early not to indulge too often. In the stillness before sleep, he whispered to himself, not a prayer, not a plan, but a quiet promise. Keep going, just one more day. And in Edwardian England, for a farmer like him, that was sometimes the bravest thing of all. By the first week of December, the pantry was more echo than storehouse. The shelves held only whispers now, a half sack of flour, a cracked jar of gooseberry jam saved for Christmas, and a heel of cheese hardened to the texture of bark. Each item was a relic, less food than symbol, less sustenance than sentiment. For Walter Tilling, the hunger had begun to feel less like pain and more like a quiet dullness, a humming in the background of his life. It was always there, beneath his ribs, in his limbs, just behind his thoughts. But it no longer alarmed him. It was simply the cost of living. The morning broke grey again. The sky had forgotten how to shine. Walter stirred the fire, coaxing the coals from ash to flicker, and poured what little oats remained into the pot. There was no milk and barely enough water. He watched as the thin gruel boiled, its bubbles like hollow promises. May sat at the table, her hands wrapped around her tin cup as if heat alone could fill her. Her face was pale, the freckles on her nose like fading stars. "It smells like nothing," she whispered. Walter offered a small smile. "It'll taste like something if you close your eyes." Their father entered just then, dusted with frost, having already seen to the animals. "Hen's gone missing," he said shortly. "Fox, I reckon. They had only 3 hens left. One fewer meant 1 less egg every other day, sometimes more, and in winter, even the hens were reluctant to lay." He sat down and took the smallest bowl, nodding his thanks, but not speaking more. That was how hunger shaped them, not into beggars or thieves, but into people of few words. Speech took energy, hope took more. Outside, the world was wet with melted frost. The earth was too sodden to plough and too hard to dig. Still, work had to be found, even if it did not pay. They cleared brambles along the lane, hauled firewood from the hedgerows, patched the leaky troughs. Their hands moved from task to task, though their stomachs cried out for rest. Around midday, Walter passed the vicar's wife in the lane. She was wrapped in furs, her cheeks flushed pink from her morning ride. She smiled at him, though the smile was more habit than care. "Are you coming to the charity supper next week?" she asked sweetly. Walter nodded, though he knew they might. Not. Pride was a fragile thing in their family, and though they had little to eat, they still clung to dignity as if it were bread. The charity supper was an annual event held in the parish hall. Porridge for the poor, with hymns singing afterward. It was meant to comfort, but it often felt more like observation. The gentry would stand near the doors, watching, nodding, murmuring about good Christian works, while farmers and labourers swallowed their shame with each spoonful. When Walter returned home, the fire was low again. May had fallen asleep near it, her doll clutched in one hand. Their father sat at the table, cleaning his boots with a rag. "We'll need to stretch the flour," he said without looking up. Walter nodded. "I could try and snare something, a rabbit maybe." His father paused, then shook his head. "Ainsley's, land. They'll jail you for it, boy. But we're starving." "There are worse things than hunger," his father said flatly. "You won't help us from a cell." Walter bit his lip. He understood, but he also understood the ache in his bones, the hollowness that made him dizzy if he stood too fast. That night, dinner was boiled nettles with a crumbled crust of barley bread. They ate slowly, savouring every bitter mouthful. It filled the stomach, if not the soul. Afterward, their father spoke again, rare for 2 sentences in one evening. "I remember a time when your grandfather could fatten 2 pigs by October," he said. "We had meat near every Sunday, pudding too." May's eyes lit up. "What kind of pudding?" "Suet pudding," he said softly, "with dried currants. Your gran made it in a cloth bag, boiled it for hours." Walter closed his eyes, trying to summon the scent. He could almost smell it, rich, sweet, spiced, but the memory was his father's, not his. For Walter, pudding was a story, not a taste. "Think we'll ever have that again?" May asked quietly. Their father looked at the fire, then at them. "We might." It was not a lie, but it wasn't a promise either. That night, Walter lay awake, listening to the wind. The thatch above his bed rustled like dry grass. His stomach grumbled softly, and he pressed a hand against it. He wondered what it would be like to wake with a full belly, to know breakfast was waiting, to not count eggs, to not ration bread, to not pretend water was broth. He wondered what it would be like to eat and not feel guilty, but there were no answers in the dark. Only the slow drift of thought into uneasy sleep. And in Edwardian England, where tenant farmers worked the land, but could rarely feed themselves from it, the hearth was not the heart of the home. It was the mouth of a cold, hungry silence that never quite went away. Winter was a season of numbers. How many logs were left in the pile? How many coals in the scuttle? How many nights remained before the frost would lift, before the ground would soften, before hunger gave way to the weary promise of planting again? Walter, Tilling sat cross-legged near the hearth, gently coaxing a dying ember with the poker. He did it slowly, with reverence, the way a priest might adjust a candle on an altar. In his home, fire was not just warmth, it was survival, and survival was never certain. The coal bin was nearly empty. Just a handful of chunks remained at the bottom, black and glistening like beetles in a trap. There had once been a time when coal was delivered to the cottage by cart, offloaded with cheerful thumps into the shed. But that was before prices had risen, before the mine strikes had shaken the country, before the squire's accounts had decided they could no longer extend credit. Now coal was fetched in sacks, small and rationed, paid for in coins that Walter's family no longer possessed. He heard his father's boots approaching from the lean-to. "We'll stretch it 2 more days," the older man muttered, brushing snow from his sleeves. "After that, we burn what we can." Walter didn't ask what we can meant. He already knew. Broken furniture, dry brambles, even old books if it came to it. Anything that caught flame. There was something particularly cruel about the cold when it came not as a storm, but as a steady, endless presence. It crept in through cracks in the stone, seeped beneath the door, coiled itself around fingers and feet. It made the air thick with silence and the walls feel further apart, and at night, it bit. May had taken to sleeping beside the hearth, wrapped in blankets and whatever coats they could spare. Her cheeks were pale, her lips dry. She rarely spoke anymore, unless spoken to. The cough had become her voice. One evening, Walter came back from chopping branches by the lane and found his sister quietly rubbing her hands together near the coals. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Why does the manor have so much coal?" she asked softly. "You can smell it from the hill." Walter sat beside her, removing his gloves slowly. "Because they can pay for it. Because they don't have to choose between fire and flour." It wasn't bitterness in his voice. Not quite. It was something deeper, resignation laced with an ember of disbelief. How could 2 homes under the same sky live in such different worlds? At the manor, fires burned in every room, even in rooms not used. Lord Ainsley's hounds had heated kennels, and his carriage lanterns were powered by oil imported from the coast. Yet a mile down the road, the Tillings scraped frost from the inside of their windows and huddled around coals the size of apples. The injustice of it simmered, unspoken, but present in every stiff joint and frost-nipped toe. On Sunday, the family attended service at St. Agnes's, more for warmth than worship. The church was one of the few places heated by more than breath. Walter sat stiffly in the pew, his hands tucked under his arms, listening to the curate speak of charity and patience. After the service, the vicar's wife handed out bundles, each one wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside, bread, cheese, and a small tin of treacle. Walter accepted it with a nod. His father said nothing. Back home, they opened the tin like it was treasure. May's eyes lit up at the sight of the dark syrup, and for a rare moment she smiled. Walter dipped a finger in, tasted the sweetness. It was the first time in weeks that something had delighted him. That night, they spread the treacle over toasted bits of old bread, soaking in the warmth of both the fire and the moment. It was not enough, but it was something. Still, the cold returned, as it always did. They rationed the coals carefully, 2 in the morning, 3 at night. On the worst days, none at all. Walter took to sleeping in his coat, curled beneath 2 layers of blankets with his feet pressed against a brick they'd heated in the fire. Sometimes, he wondered what it would feel like to be warm through and through, not the fleeting kind of warmth that comes from standing by the fire, but a warmth that lives inside you, a warmth that doesn't run out. In schoolbooks, he had once read about Mediterranean lands, places where orange trees bloomed in December and children wore linen shirts year-round. He tried to imagine that sun on his skin, the taste of oranges, but the image faded quickly, replaced by the snap of a frostbitten branch and the sting of a cold nail against bare skin. There were no oranges here, only turnips and tea, and fire when it could be afforded. By month's end, the coal bin stood empty. Walter stared into it one morning, hoping somehow the darkness would give birth to one more piece. It did not. He turned away, and returned to the hearth, where his father was breaking apart the last of the old chair, one that had belonged to Walter's grandfather. Its legs were cracked, the seat sunken, but it had once been carved by hand, a gift from a better time. They fed it to the flames without ceremony. In Edwardian England, for the poor and the rural, warmth was not a given. It was not a comfort. It was a resource, a calculation, a cost, and, in the small stone cottage at the edge of Lord Ainsley's estate, the Tillings learned once again that even the fire could betray them, fading into embers too quickly, leaving behind nothing but smoke and silence. The manor stood like a crown above the village, its chimneys ever smoking, its windows ever glowing. From the valley below, where Walter Tilling's family lived among the mud and straw, the estate seemed not merely distant in location, but in meaning. It belonged to another realm, one gilded in privilege, buffered by rules written by the comfortable and enforced upon the hungry. Lord Alaric Ainsley, master of the estate, was not a cruel man, or at least not deliberately so. He believed himself fair, generous even. Hadn't he provided firewood to the chapel last Christmas? Hadn't he donated a crate of apples to the harvest feast? Hadn't he spared the Reynolds boy from eviction after the accident? But kindness from above was a strange and precarious thing. It was never asked for, rarely reliable, and always framed as benevolence rather than justice. In Edwardian England, power did not speak softly. It whispered through contracts, smiled, through expectations, and thundered through silence. Walter had seen Lord Ainsley up close only a handful of times. Once during the estate's midsummer picnic, when the gentry watched races and children were handed lemonade in glass jars. Another time at church, where the Lord sat in the family pew near the altar, his hat held respectfully in his lap as the curate praised charity. And again, when two men were dismissed from field work without warning, replaced by machines shipped in from Norwich. That last time left a mark. Mr. Glover and his eldest son had worked Ainsley land for nearly 2 decades. They lived in a tied cottage just beyond the old oak ridge. When the new thresher arrived, loud, mechanical, smelling of oil, they were told their services were no longer needed. Progress, Lord Ainsley had said, with a tone of reluctant regret, as if the machine's arrival had been a natural disaster, not a choice. The Glovers packed their few belongings and left before the week was out. No wages, no farewell. Just a note pinned to the gate, thanking them for their loyalty. Walter remembered the silence that followed. No one spoke of it, not because they didn't care, but because they all understood. It could be any of them next. Tenancy was not security. It was permission, temporary, revocable, and deeply conditional. The land was not theirs, even when they'd worked it for generations. It belonged to the manor, to the name Ainsley, to the ledgers kept by pale men with ink-stained fingers. On a bitter Tuesday afternoon, Walter and his father were summoned to the estate. A ditch had overflowed near the sheep pasture, and it was causing flooding in the lower fields. They walked the lane in silence, boots squelching in wet earth, eyes downcast. One did not look too long at the manor. One entered quietly, worked quickly, and left without opinion. They were greeted at the rear gate by Mr. Orton, the steward. He was a thin man with neat gloves and a permanent frown, as if every minute not spent counting was a personal affront. Water's making a mess, he said, without preamble. His lordship wants it cleared by week's end. Walter's father nodded. We'll need tools. There's a spade near the east fence. That should suffice. Suffice. The word hung. In the air like fog, they worked the ditch until sundown. The soil was stubborn, waterlogged and heavy, and the spade bent on the second hour. Still, they pressed on. Ainsley's sheep stood on the rise above them, oblivious and well-fed. Walter's hands blistered beneath his gloves. The cold had numbed them earlier, but now with movement the pain bloomed. Still, he said nothing. His father didn't either. At one point, Lord Ainsley himself appeared on horseback, accompanied by two gentlemen in long coats and polished boots. They spoke of land use, enclosure, and game rights. One of them laughed, an easy, rich laugh, and said something about the quaintness of country life. They didn't acknowledge the Tillings, not a nod, not a glance. That night, Walter lay awake again, staring at the cracked ceiling, the weight of the manor pressing down on his chest, like a dream he could not escape. He thought of how the land rose to meet Ainsley's estate, and how the sun seemed to break on its roofline first before spilling reluctantly down into the valley. He thought of how their lives were determined not by what they grew, but by who owned the dirt beneath their feet. Even the mud had a master. In the weeks that followed, Walter noticed more changes. A new fence was erected along the north field, cutting off a path commonly used by the villagers. A man came to survey the woods, muttering about development and pheasant preserves, and the steward's visits grew more frequent, measuring, noting, frowning. Whispers began to stir in the village. The manor was selling off parcels to a railway company. New men would come, new machines. The land would shift beneath them again. For the tenant farmers, the word progress no longer meant hope. It meant upheaval. It meant eviction notices and red lines on maps. It meant watching the past disappear into contracts written in drawing, rooms no labourer would ever enter. In Edwardian England, the lord on the hill did not need to raise his voice to command obedience. His power was not loud. It was inherited, enforced by expectation, and as present as the stone underfoot. And for Walter, it became increasingly clear. The land did not belong to those who worked it. It belonged to those who had never once felt its hunger. Sundays were meant to be different. A day of rest, reflection, and redemption. A day when farmers like the Tillings could set aside their spades and scythes, put on their best clothes, and walk to church as if they were something more than the week's burdens made flesh. But in Edwardian England, even Sundays carried their weight in quiet humiliation. Walter stood by the small-looking glass nailed above the hearth, trying to smooth the sleeves of his worn shirt. It was one of two he owned, the better one, though its collar had frayed and the cuffs had been turned twice already. His trousers, patched at the knee and let out at the waist, had belonged to a cousin now long moved to the Midlands. The boots were his father's old pair, half a size too large, stuffed with straw at the toe. May sat on the bench near the door, her dress carefully mended, her hair braided as neatly as her cough allowed. Their father adjusted his own collar with fingers that trembled slightly from cold or fatigue or both. They did not speak of vanity. To appear presentable on a Sunday was not pride, it was defence. Respectability was armour, and even if it was threadbare and ill-fitting, it mattered. The walk to St. Agnes's was slow, marked by the crunch of frost underfoot, and the occasional greeting murmured to neighbours trudging along the same path. No one looked too closely at each other's clothes, but everyone saw. That was the unspoken ritual. Acknowledge presence, not condition. At the church, warmth seeped from the open doors, along with the faint scent of beeswax and stone. They took their usual place near the back, not out of humility, but habit. The pews at the front were for the better off, the estate manager, the shopkeeper's widow, the schoolmaster and his wife. Farther still, under the stained glass windows, sat Lord Ainsley and his guests, their gloves tucked into their coat pockets, hymnals bound in leather. The curate began the service with a prayer for mercy, then a sermon about providence. Walter listened quietly, though the words did not reach him as they once had. The notion of divine provision felt distant, like summer strawberries in December, lovely in theory but impossible to grasp. After the service, the congregation gathered, in the yard, forming little clusters like sheep unsure of which way the wind would blow. The vicar's wife made her rounds, distributing smiles and parcels from the parish box. Walter accepted theirs with a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am," not quite meeting her eyes. The parcel contained lard, a stub of soap, and a bar of tea. Luxuries, to be sure, but also reminders. These were not gifts, they were evidence, proof that they had nothing and someone had noticed. Later, in the narrow kitchen of their cottage, May unwrapped the soap and held it like treasure. "It smells like lemon," she said softly. Walter managed a small laugh. "Maybe we'll both smell like lemons next Sunday." Their father did not laugh. He stood by the window, looking out toward the fields, toward nothing in particular. "There's talk of the charity board coming," he said suddenly. "To inspect the cottages." Walter looked up. "Why?" "To decide who gets what. Who gets to stay. Who might be better off elsewhere." The words fell into the room like soot. The poor law was still the law, after all. Overseers and guardians who made decisions from dusty rooms, based on forms and assumptions. They could decide that a family was unsustainable, that children might be better placed in a home. They could split what the land had already broken. That week, Walter cleaned their cottage as best he could. He scrubbed the floorboards with cold water and lye, aired the bedding, and patched a crack in the window pane with waxed cloth. He clipped the hedges with the broken shears, swept the hearth, and even attempted to polish the flatware, though there were only 3 pieces left. Each act felt futile, like polishing a coin for a toll they'd never afford. But it gave him something to do, a sense of control in a world that offered so little of it. The day of the visit came without announcement. Mr. Birch, the inspector, arrived in a cart drawn by a lean grey mare. He was dressed in a heavy wool coat, his hat perched perfectly despite the wind. Walter greeted him at the gate. The man's eyes moved quickly, assessing. "Mr. Tilling in?" "In the shed, sir." "And your mother?" Walter's face twitched. "Dead these 2 years, sir." "Ah." The inspector stepped inside, notebook in hand, and glanced around the cottage. He asked questions: how much coal was left, how often the children were fed meat, whether May had seen a doctor, if they kept up with their rent, if the boy attended school. Walter answered as best he could. His father said little. May stood silently, by the hearth, clutching her doll. After 15 minutes, the man closed his notebook with a soft click. "You're keeping up," he said, not unkindly. "Barely, but we'll make note." He left a card on the table, in case anything changes, and then he was gone, a shadow disappearing down the lane. That evening the house was silent. Even the wind seemed quieter. Walter sat by the window, the card still in his hand. It bore an official seal and a name he didn't recognize. He stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into the pages of his mother's prayer book. Respectability, he realized, was not about pride or piety. It was about delay. A way to hold back the tide just long enough to breathe between the waves. In Edwardian England, there was no refuge in appearances, but there was sometimes a reprieve. And for families like the Tillings, even that was worth the effort of dressing for Sunday. The schoolhouse stood at the far edge of the village, low-roofed and squat, with windows that looked out over the lane as if in quiet judgment. It was built from grey stone and lined with ivy that never quite seemed green. On cold mornings, frost clung to the panes like lace, and the air inside was only marginally warmer than out. Walter Tilling had not been inside it for nearly 2 years. He had left school at 12, older than some, younger than most. His mother had insisted he stay, as long as possible, even when they could ill afford it. "A lad who can read," she used to say, "can choose his way someday." But when she died, the choice vanished. His father needed hands in the field, not eyes in a book. Now, on days when his chores allowed a moment of rest, Walter would pass by the schoolhouse on his way to the market, the clamour of younger voices drifting through the half-open door. Chalk on slate, recitations of scripture and arithmetic. Once, he paused outside and heard the teacher, Mr. Lindell, reading from a book about the sea, his voice lifting like a wind against the quiet. It stung, though Walter did not understand why. He hadn't loved school, not exactly, but he had loved the stories, the quiet mystery of ink on page. the way a sentence could unfold like a secret. He could still read, just barely, slowly, stumblingly. His mother had taught him before he ever held a hoe, tracing words with a finger and making him sound them out by the fire. But without practice, the letters began to blur, meanings slipping away like water between cupped hands. May still attended when she could. Her cough kept her home often, and their father rarely insisted. "The girl needs rest more than Latin," he muttered once, watching her shiver beside her slate. But even when she did go, she struggled. Her clothes were too thin, her stomach too empty, her feet sore from walking barefoot when boots wore through. The other children sometimes laughed, not cruelly, but thoughtlessly. That was worse. Walter had once asked Mr. Lindell if there was a way to study from home. The teacher, a narrow man with kind eyes and ink-stained cuffs, had smiled sadly. "Books are no good if no one's there to help you with them," he said. "And besides, there's no time, is there?" There wasn't. Not really. The village. School was technically compulsory now by law, but the law bent beneath poverty's weight. Families needed help on the farms. Boys like Walter were gone by 12. Girls, often younger. They learned their sums just well enough to avoid being cheated at market, their letters just well enough to read a sign, maybe a prayer. But beyond that, the doors closed early, not with force, but with inevitability. One day, while fetching seed from the shop, Walter overheard a conversation between two tradesmen. They spoke of jobs in the city, of clerks and railways and typewriters. "Need fast readers, proper penmanship," one said. "The new kind. Young lads, clean collars." Walter felt the words settle heavy in his chest. He could wield a scythe. Sure, fix a harness, even stitch a boot, but write a letter, read a ledger. Those were skills that unlocked doors now rusted shut before him. At home, May sat by the hearth with her slate, scrawling something with her stub of chalk. "What's that?" Walter asked, crouching beside her. "A story," she said softly, "about a goose that flies to London." He smiled, though it faded quickly. "That's good. Will you help me spell chimney?" He tried, got it wrong, guessed again. "Maybe I'll be a teacher one day," she said brightly. "Or write books." Walter nodded. You could. But the lie tasted bitter. In Edwardian England, the ladder to a better life had rungs made of literacy. And for rural children, those rungs were often broken. Education was free, in theory, but time wasn't. Nor was paper. Nor was the permission to believe in futures not tied to the soil. And what use was reading, really, if your stomach growled too loudly to hear the words? Walter sometimes wondered what would have happened had his mother lived. Would she have made him stay in school a year longer? 2. Would she have read him one more story? Taught him one more rule? Would it have been enough? He didn't know. He'd never know. That night, he sat by the candlelight, his mother's old Bible in hand. The words were faded. He traced them slowly, sounding them out beneath his breath. He reached a passage about labour and grace, though he only half understood it, but he read it, word by word, letter by letter. And in that act, quiet and slow, there was something like defiance. In Edwardian England, knowledge was a door few poor folk could reach, let alone open. But Walter still pressed his hand against it, still searched for the key, even if it came chipped and second-hand, even if the words didn't come easy. It began as a whisper in the chest. May's cough had always been there, soft and lingering, like a curtain fluttering at a cracked window. But as winter deepened and the frost hardened in the hedgerows, her cough changed. It grew deeper, sharper, dry and hollow like the sound of a knuckle rapping on wood. In the dim light of the Tilling cottage, it echoed through the walls, not loud but insistent, and it was not just the cough, but the way she moved slower, the way her eyes seemed glassier by candlelight, and how she turned her face to the wall during mealtimes, pushing away the thin soup they had struggled to prepare. Walter watched her, with a knot forming in his chest. His sister, already fragile, already thinned by too many skipped meals and too many cold nights, was slipping, quietly but surely. Their father said little, his jaw clenched tighter each day, his eyes shadowed beneath the brow of a man who had lived too long with things he could not change. "We'll keep her warm," he muttered one evening. "Blankets, boil water, sweat it out." But warmth was a commodity they no longer had in abundance. The last of the coal had been burned. Firewood, damp and dwindling, offered only flickers. Their kindling came now from the broken rungs of a chair, old fence posts, and a few dry pages from a worn almanac. Walter sat up each night by the hearth, feeding the flames inch by inch and watching over May as she slept fitfully. He dabbed her forehead with rags dipped in cold water and coaxed teaspoons of broth between her lips when she could swallow. The moments of clarity came rarely. Her voice, when it rose, sounded like it belonged to someone far older. "Walter," she whispered, one night, her hand gripping his wrist. "Will I die?" He didn't answer. He just shook his head slowly and squeezed her hand. That was enough. In rural Edwardian England, illness was a grim and familiar presence. It did not inspire panic, but resignation. There were no regular doctors for the poor. There were no local apothecaries with clean bottles on tidy shelves. There was only distance and silence, and the faint hope that what afflicted you might pass before the decision to act became impossible. The doctor, if you could afford him, was miles away in the next town, and not likely to travel the lanes for charity, and charity was all the Tillings had to offer. On the 4th day of her fever, Walter walked into the village, his boots cutting through frozen puddles and thin snow. He made his way to the vicarage, not because he believed the curate would cure her, but because he was the only man in town with the means to summon a doctor. Mrs. Golding, the vicar's wife, answered the door. Her expression shifted from concern to formality the moment Walter explained. "We'll do what we can," she said kindly, though her eyes flickered with something less certain. "Mr. Linton has many calls this week, but we'll send word." Walter thanked her, took the offered parcel of tea and powdered ginger, and left. He did not believe help would come, and he was right. That night, May's breathing turned shallow, her skin hot beneath layers of rough cloth. Their father knelt by the bed, watching her chest rise and fall with the weight of something invisible. "If she worsens by dawn," he said, "we'll send for old Brant." Old Brant was the village shepherd, but he was known to mix tinctures and poultices. Not a doctor, but something like one, when no better option remained. But May didn't worsen, nor did she improve. She lingered. Walter took it upon himself to clean the cottage from end to end. He scrubbed the stone floors, opened the windows for fresh air despite the cold, boiled water with herbs from the hedgerow, not because he believed these things would save her, but because he had to do something, anything. On the 6th day, a knock came at the door. Walter opened it to find the doctor, not Dr. Linton himself, but his assistant, a boy scarcely older than Walter. "Sorry for the delay," the assistant muttered. "Came as quick as we could." He examined May, checked her breath, her pulse, then stood and scribbled a note onto a folded card. "Not much to be done," he said. "Keep her warm. Feed her broth. If you can, fetch horehound or licorice root. Might ease the chest." He offered them a small bottle, cough syrup, thick and sweet, and a price scrawled in pencil. Walter reached into the cupboard, took out the last coins his mother had once saved in a tin behind the flour sack. It wasn't enough, but the assistant took it anyway. Then he was gone. That night, the three of them sat in silence. The fire burned low. The syrup was given in tiny spoonfuls. May opened her eyes once, smiled faintly, then fell back into a doze. Walter watched her as he always did, but this time with something new stirring in his chest. Not fear, not quite hope, but a quiet understanding. They were alone. They had always been alone. In the countryside of Edwardian England, sickness did not summon rescue. It summoned waiting. waiting for the body to decide, waiting for time to relent, waiting for death to pass by one cottage and settle in another. And, when after days more, May's cough softened, and colour began to return to her cheeks, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like reprieve. A breath, not a song. They had survived this time, just barely. But in a world without doctors, without warmth, without rest, survival was not certainty. It was chance. And for those who lived close to the earth, illness was not a stranger. It was a shadow, always near, always waiting for the quietest hour. In winter, even friendships froze. The village of Milcombe, once held together by shared hardship and hedge-lined footpaths, began to show cracks as the frost deepened. Neighbours no longer lingered in doorways. Voices that once called cheerfully across fields now fell silent behind shutters. The cold had a way of settling not only in the bones, but in the space between people. Walter Tilling felt the shift most acutely when he walked the lane toward the market. Heads turned a little quicker. Greetings, when offered, were clipped and cautious. It wasn't rudeness, it was weariness. Each family, each cottage, fought their own small war against the creeping chill and thinning larders. And war left little room for kindness. But more than the frost, it was something else that stirred division, envy. The Glovers had returned, or rather, their eldest son, Harold. After being dismissed from Lord Ainsley's lands the previous season, Harold had found work as a railway porter. He now arrived each Sunday in boots newly polished, with a waistcoat snug and proud. His hands no longer bore the deep calluses of the field, and he spoke with the crispness of someone who had seen another world and chosen not to look back. Some admired him, others did not. "Thinks he's better now," muttered Mr. Pilcher one morning as Walter passed the blacksmith's. "Wouldn't last a week without his uniform and his city wages." Walter said nothing. He didn't know Harold well, but he recognized the sharpness behind those words. It was the same sharpness that came when a man realized someone else had escaped a cage he hadn't even known was there. At the market, Walter overheard two women whispering about the miller's sheep gone missing. "Fox maybe," one said, "or maybe not. Folk do desperate things in lean winters." Another replied, "It's not foxes that wear boots." That was the new fear. Not hunger, but what hunger might push someone to do. The Tillings, too, had begun to lock their shed at night, not with a real lock, which they couldn't afford, but with a bar of wood wedged firmly across the door. It felt strange, guarding things that had so little value. But in hard times, even a rusted hoe or a chipped axe became treasure. Walter noticed it first with Mr. Griggs, their nearest neighbour. The old man had always shared cider at harvest and stories by the fire. But now when Walter waved from the lane, Griggs merely nodded and pulled his coat tighter, disappearing into the smoke of his own chimney. The feeling grew, a subtle shift in the way people stood, in how quickly doors closed, in the absence of borrowed tools and shared salt. Then came the incident. It was early January when it happened. A small sack of seed disappeared from the back of the parish store. Nothing valuable to the gentry, but for the villagers it meant the difference between planting early or late. And everyone knew that late seed meant late crops, and hunger come autumn. No one saw the theft, but accusations came all the same. "It's the orphan boy," said one. "The Tinkers, maybe." Then, one evening, someone mentioned the Tillings, quietly, carefully, but enough. "They've had it rough. The girl was ill. The boy's always about. Could be need drove them." Walter heard it from May, who had heard it from a child at school. When he told his father, the old man said nothing for a long while. Then he spat into the fire and murmured, "Fear makes fools of friends." That night, Walter lay awake, staring at the rafters. He had never stolen a thing in his life, but he knew it wouldn't matter. In a village like theirs, guilt was often less about truth and more about proximity. The next day, he walked the long way to the market, avoiding the village square. On his return, he caught a glimpse of Harold Glover speaking with Mr. Lindell outside the schoolhouse. They laughed, lightly, like men without heavy coats, and Walter felt something sharp twist in his gut. Not anger, not quite, but something close to longing, wrapped in the bitterness of being left behind. Still, not everyone turned cold. Mrs. Penfold, the widow with 5 sons and a garden full of leeks, left a wrapped parcel at their doorstep 2 nights later. Inside was a half loaf of barley bread and a small paper of dried thyme. No note, just the offering. May cried when she opened it. The next morning, Walter returned the kindness with a sack of firewood he had chopped from fallen branches in the Pam Common. He left it quietly at her door. No one spoke of it. That was the way of things. Silent exchanges, wordless gestures, dignity preserved in the hush. But even so, the village continued to fracture. The frost had entered their homes, yes, but it had also entered their hearts. In Edwardian England, poverty was not only a burden, it was a wedge. It turned neighbour against neighbour, friend into rival, suspicion into habit, and for those who had little, trust became the first thing to vanish in the cold. Walter saw it now, as clearly as the icicles that hung from their eaves. The danger wasn't just starvation or sickness, it was solitude, because in a village where everyone feared falling, no one reached out a hand. There was something unusual about the way the frost clung to the edges of Mrs. Penfold's garden. Most of the land in Milcombe lay sleeping under ice, the ground hard and unyielding, like stone beneath the soles. But just beyond the low stone wall at the far end of the village, a corner of earth seemed to resist the silence of winter. Green tips peeked from beneath straw, and a faint scent, earthy, herbal, alive, lingered in the air. Walter first noticed it while passing by on an errand to the parish. His eyes, so used to grey and brown, caught a flicker of life. He paused. There, amid the frozen world, rows of something grew. Curiosity overcame caution. He hesitated at the gate, but was called forward before he could knock. "Well then," came a voice, steady and sharp. "Don't just stand there like a scarecrow. Come see the leeks before the frost gets bold again." Mrs. Penfold was in her garden, wrapped in 3 shawls and a scarf, crouching low over a bed of soil bordered with bricks. Her gloved hands were gentle but deliberate, brushing straw aside from narrow green stalks. Walter stepped lightly through the gate. "I thought nothing grew this time of year," he said. "Most things don't," she replied. "But some never." Got the message. He crouched beside her, eyeing the soil. It wasn't rich, not here, not anywhere around Milcombe, but it was turned, clean and purposeful. Straw lay thick across the beds, and twigs had been fashioned into crude frames. It wasn't the kind of garden you saw in paintings. It was something else, something more stubborn. "You keep them alive through the frost?" he asked. "Aye," she nodded. "With care and patience. 2 things people forget are still useful." She stood and stretched her back with a quiet groan, then gestured toward her narrow path. "Come." She led him to a bench she had crafted from crates and a length of timber shaded beneath the naked arms of an apple tree. "I've had this garden since my boys were small," she said. "Grew herbs in coffee tins, then root veg in broken barrels, leeks, turnips, radish, not fancy things, but they come back. If you coax them." Walter looked at her hands, gnarled, worn, but still working. "Does it help? Through winter I mean." Mrs. Penfold gave a half smile. "Hope isn't always loud, lad. Sometimes it's just knowing something's growing when everything else seems dead." Her words hung there, quiet but weighty, like fog over the fields. They sat in silence for a while. Walter felt his shoulders ease, the tension in his chest softening for the first time in weeks. There was something about her garden, untidy, imperfect, but undeniably alive, that made the world feel just a little more possible. Before he left, she handed him a bundle wrapped in a bit of cloth. 3 small carrots, wrinkled but bright, and a pinch of dried sage. "For your stew," she said, And don't try to refuse. I've too much and no mouths to feed but mine." He thanked her and left with the bundle tucked under his arm, as if it were treasure. At home, May's eyes lit up at the sight. "Real carrots?" Walter nodded and chopped them into the pot with care. The scent of sage filled the kitchen, faint but comforting. They ate in silence, savoring each spoonful like a feast. That night, while May slept and the wind pressed soft against the shutter, Walter sat by the fire and stared at the flame. He thought of the garden, of hands in the dirt, of green stalks in the snow, of something that resisted the cold simply because it could. The next morning, he rose before dawn and stepped outside. The frost had settled again, sharp on every surface, but the idea, quiet, slow, like a root pushing through soil, had taken hold. He found a patch of earth along the back wall, where the stone held a little warmth from the sun. He began to clear it, scooping away wet leaves, breaking apart the clumps of frozen dirt. His father came out a while later, watching him from the doorstep. "You digging graves or trying to wake spring?" the old man asked. Walter smiled. "Just thinking we might grow something come thaw." His father said nothing, but later that day, Walter found him breaking apart an old crate into planks for a fence. The next week, Walter returned to Mrs. Penfold's, this time with an offering, a bundle of firewood wrapped in string. She accepted it with a small nod and handed him an envelope of seeds in return: onion, cress, and hardy kale. "Try them. Even if only one comes up, you've done something most folks forgot how to do. Begin." Walter spent the next few weeks tending the patch, covering it in straw, tilling gently when the frost loosened. It wasn't much, but it was enough, and in time, green would rise from that soil. In Edwardian England, hope did not come in banners or bold proclamations. It came in soil beneath the fingernails, in the persistence of a leak against the snow, in the choice to believe that even the coldest earth could one day soften. Walter learned this not from books or sermons, but from a widow's garden, growing quiet and steady at the edge of a village frozen in time. The letter came on a Thursday, tucked between a rolled newspaper and a folded sheet of accounts from the estate. It was not sealed with wax or adorned with crest, just a plain brown envelope, creased at the corners, addressed in a careful but impersonal hand. Walter found it wedged into the doorframe when he returned from mending a fence in the far field. He recognized the handwriting at once: Mr. Autumn, the estate steward. He handed the envelope to his father, who took it without a word, opened it slowly, and read in silence. Then, with the same slowness, he folded the letter and placed it on the table. "Rent's due by month's end," he said. "Full quarter, no extensions." The words hung in the room like mist after rain, quiet but impossible to ignore. Walter didn't respond. He didn't need to. The numbers were already tumbling in his head. How much they owed, how much they had, how little had come in since autumn. They sold eggs when the hens laid, firewood when they could spare it, and May's old clothes to the vicar's maid. But it wasn't enough. Never enough. Rent was the great shadow, always looming. Unlike illness, it did not come and go. It was constant. It did not kill quickly. It wore you down, slowly, like a boot against gravel. Their family did not own the land they worked, nor the cottage they lived in, nor the well they drew from, nor the path they walked each morning to the field. Everything belonged to Lord Ainsley, and everything came with a price. The rent had not risen in years, they were told. It was fair, but fairness meant little when wages had shrunk, when the land yielded less each season, and when the tools broke faster than they could be mended. Walter thought back to a time when his mother kept ledgers in a notebook, neat columns of hens, feed, rent, candles, soap. She used to say that numbers, if honest, could tell you what to do. But these numbers didn't offer direction. They offered despair. The next day, Walter and his father went to the mill to sell what little barley they had left. The miller shook his head before they even opened the sack. "Mildewed," he said, sniffing the grain. "I'll take it for feed. 2p the stone." It was half the usual price. They accepted it anyway. On their walk home, they passed the newly repaired north wall of the estate, where 2 hired men, strangers, were laying fresh mortar. Walter's father glanced toward them. "Paid in coin," he said quietly. "Not in potatoes." Walter looked up. "You ever think of leaving? Like Harold Glover?" His father didn't answer at first. Then, "And go where?" "Anywhere. There's nowhere that doesn't want something from you. Here, they want your back. Elsewhere, they want your soul." It wasn't cynicism. It was just the truth as he saw it. When they returned home, they laid the coins on the table beside the rent letter. It was not enough. It would never be enough. Walter watched his father pick up the letter again, run a thumb along the crease, then set it back down as if it burned. Later that week, they received a visit from Mr. Orton himself. He arrived unannounced, as always, in his long grey coat and neatly brushed boots, carrying his ledgers like a judge carries law. "Just checking in," he said at the door. "Lord Ainsley wants to ensure all accounts are up to date before the spring reviews." Walter's father nodded. "We're working toward it." "Yes," said Orton, glancing about the room. "Of course." He made a few notes, looked over the fireplace, the worn floorboards, the patched window. "I understand times have been difficult," he said, with the tone of someone who had never known hunger. "But Lord Ainsley expects good stewardship. A cottage must remain productive to be justified. You understand?" Walter clenched his fists. "What happens," he asked, "if we don't pay?" Orton paused. "Then another family, perhaps one better equipped, is offered the tenancy. And we would need to make alternative arrangements, as though it were so simple." When he left, May asked what he meant. "It means," Walter said gently, "we have to find the money." The family met that evening by the hearth. Ideas were scarce. Selling tools would leave them unequipped. Selling the goat would remove their only steady source of milk. They had nothing of luxury, no clocks, no silver, no heirlooms. But they did have a small plot of barley stored away. Not enough for market, but perhaps enough to tempt old Wren, the innkeeper, for his brewing. Walter made the trade the next morning. It was a hard bargain. Wren drove a tight one, but it was done. They gathered every coin they had, laid them out in careful rows, counted again, still short. That night, as Walter stared into the low-burning fire, his father reached for the small wooden box in the cupboard. Inside was his mother's wedding ring, tucked into a folded handkerchief. "We sell this," he said, "and we cover it." Walter looked at the ring. It was simple, gold, worn smooth from years of wear. "She'd understand," his father added. Walter wasn't sure, but he nodded. The next morning, the ring was sold to a travelling trader. It fetched enough, barely. The rent was paid, but it came not with relief, only silence. Because in Edwardian England, rent was not a payment, it was a leash. And no matter how hard you worked, how much you sacrificed, how tightly you clenched your jaw, the soil you tended was never truly yours. It belonged to another, always. And if you failed to pay for your own labour, for your own shelter, you would be turned out, not by force, but by signature, and no one would say it wasn't fair. The market at Stotfold was a place of motion. Even in winter, it hummed with the subdued energy of people who had little but were compelled to trade, to bargain, to move. Carts arrived in the early light, their wheels creaking, horses steaming, from breath and exertion. Stalls unfolded like fabric along the square, and beneath the muted sky, goods were set out as though by ritual. Baskets of apples browned by frost, jars of pickles clouded with brine, and cloth scraps folded with care. Walter, Tilling, stood at the edge of it all, basket in hand, the weight of the day already pulling at his shoulders. His father walked beside him, silent as always, his hands red from cold, his eyes scanning the stalls not with curiosity, but calculation. They brought little, 6 eggs, a small wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, and a tightly bundled stack of kindling. It was what they could spare without going hungry or cold themselves. Yet even these meagre offerings felt almost extravagant. They set up near the fountain, where foot traffic passed in waves, and laid out their goods on an upturned crate. They had no stall license, but no one would bother them for that. Not this year. Not when half the vendors sold without one, and the constable turned a blind eye so long as no trouble was stirred. Walter watched the crowd, listened to the steady murmur of barter and exchange. Voices overlapped, some light, others tired. People haggled over prices like life depended on it, and perhaps it did. A halfpenny off the price of turnips might mean a candle for the evening. A bundle of twigs might buy enough salt to last. The week, a woman stopped by inspecting their eggs. "Hen-fed?" she asked. "No wheat," Walter replied. "They forage." She nodded, placed 3 in her basket, and handed over a halfpenny and a smile. The first sale of the day. Others came slowly. A man in a worn topcoat bought the kindling, offered a copper farthing and a cracked joke. A child wandered past, stared at the cheese, then vanished before Walter could speak. Time dragged. Walter slipped away briefly to look at the other stalls. He passed the fishmonger, whose salted sprats were already half gone, and the tinker, whose table held battered spoons and dented kettles. There was a girl selling skeins of thread dyed in faded colours, and beside her, a blind fiddler playing a tune that was more memory than music. At a corner near the bakery, he found the used book cart. He always stopped there, even if only to look. His fingers brushed the worn spines, travelogues, sermons, a tattered copy of Robinson Crusoe. The seller gave a small nod, but said nothing. They both knew Walter had no coin to spend. Back at their makeshift stall, his father had traded the cheese to Mr. Lather, the tailor, for a spool of black thread and 2 buttons. Practical things. Useful. Still, Walter felt a small twist of disappointment. They needed flour, salt, candles, maybe a sliver of soap. None had yet been bought. A man approached, heavy-set, his breath steaming as he looked down at the empty crate. "You the Tillings?" he asked. Walter's father nodded. "I heard you might have a goat for sale. Is that true?" Walter glanced at his father, then back to the man. He wore a butcher's apron, stained at the hem. Walter didn't like the look in his eyes. "She's old," his father said. "Still milks, but not for much longer." "How much?" 5 shillings, the man grunted. 3, 4, a pause. Then the man nodded. "I'll come by tomorrow." He turned and left, without handshake or farewell. Walter exhaled. The goat was one of the few constants in their lives. Her milk had sustained them through long weeks. But they needed the coin. They always needed the coin. They packed up shortly after. The eggs were gone, the kindling sold, the cheese bartered. In their place were 2 candles, a cloth sack of barley, flour, and the promise of a payment yet to come. It wasn't enough, but it was something. On the walk home, neither spoke. The wind had picked up, and the sky threatened snow. As they passed the hedgerow near the Miller's Lane, Walter kicked a stone, watched it skip along the path. He thought of Harold Glover, now working in the city, of his polished boots, his quiet confidence. He wondered what it would feel like to walk through a market not with anxiety, but ease. At home, May greeted them with a hopeful look. "Did we get sugar?" "No," Walter said, setting down the flour. "But we have barley." She nodded, masking her disappointment with practiced grace. "Barley's good." That night, they made porridge with what they had, the fire low but steady. May hummed a tune as she stirred the pot, and their father sat polishing a handle that had split from the hoe. Walter sat by the window, the market still lingering in his mind. The voices, the smells, the passing glances, and the feeling that everything there had a price. Because in Edwardian England, markets were not celebrations of commerce, they were battlegrounds, places where need wrestled with scarcity, where dignity was traded alongside eggs, and where hope was measured in ounces and pence. You brought what you could, asked for less than you needed, and left with whatever the day allowed. And always, it was less than you hoped. There was a drawer in the corner of the Tilling cottage, narrow, uneven, and stuck in place by years of swollen wood and damp air. It creaked when pulled, resisting as if unwilling to reveal what it kept. And inside, among loose buttons, bits of string, a cracked china handle, and faded ration cards, were pages, dozens of them, each one folded carefully, written in pencil or ink that had begun to smudge, and none of them addressed. Some were on old butcher's paper, some on the backs of outdated notices, and a few on scraps of schoolbook margins. These were Walter's letters. He had started writing them when he was 12, after his mother's funeral, when the house fell quieter than silence allowed. At first he wrote to her, childlike letters about chores and chickens, about how May had cried one night, and how he'd tried to make her laugh with a story about a fox that stole eggs from the squire's larder. But soon the letters changed. They began to drift towards something else, written to no one, or perhaps to the future. Each began the same way, "If I ever leave this place." And from there, the words would scatter. Some rambling with the enthusiasm of imagined freedom, others short and sharp, like a door closing. In one, he wrote about London, not the London described in his father's bitter mutterings, of grime and pickpockets and chimney soot, but the London Walter saw in his dreams. Wide streets, lit gas lamps, libraries with warm benches, and boys in clean coats who read books for hours without being scolded. In another, he wrote about the sea, about a ship called Mayflower II, named for his sister, that sailed to distant places where men worked under a foreign sun, and sent letters home filled with pressed flowers and coins from lands without snow. And in yet another, more quietly, he simply described a small house with windows that opened easily and no landlord's name written in the deeds. He never showed them to anyone, not out of shame, but out of fragility. They were dreams, and dreams in Edwardian England were brittle things. Too much air, too much light, and they would crumble. But he wrote them anyway, often late at night, by candlelight, when the fire was just embers and the wind howled outside like a dog too old to bark. He would sit at the table with pencil in hand, head bowed, and pour out the part of himself that had no place in the fields. May caught him once. She had risen for water and stood in the doorway, watching as he folded a page. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still husky from sleep. "Just writing," he said. "A letter?" He nodded. "Can I see?" Walter hesitated, then handed her one of the older ones, a gentler one, about planting dreams instead of seeds. May read slowly, lips moving with each word. When she finished, she handed it back with care. "It's lovely," she whispered. "Where do they go?" He smiled faintly. "Nowhere. You should send them. There's no address." May sat beside him, curling into the chair like a cat seeking warmth. "Then maybe one day you'll find one." The words stayed with him. A week later, while preparing to walk into town with his father to post a note to his uncle, a simple message about barley and goats, Walter folded one of his own letters into a separate envelope. He sealed it, though. It had no name on the front, and tucked it into his coat. At the post house, the clerk was sorting sacks with gloved hands. "Letter to Petworth?" the man asked. "Yes," Walter's father said, fishing coins from his pocket. Walter hesitated, then held out his own letter. "Got another," he murmured. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Where's it going?" "Wherever you like." The man gave a dry chuckle. "We don't send wishes, lad." "Then call it charity." The clerk stared at him a moment, then took the envelope and tucked it beneath a bundle. "All right then, one for the wind." Walter didn't expect it to reach anyone. That wasn't the point. The act of letting it go. That was what mattered. Back home, he didn't mention it to anyone. But he wrote more, a new one each week. He placed them in the drawer with the rest, though a few now had stamps, saved from old envelopes or begged from neighbours. It became a ritual, a quiet rebellion. In a world where their lives were dictated by crop yields, rental notices, and the quiet indifference of the landowners, writing was the one thing no one taxed, no one measured. It did not fill the larder or warm the feet, but it carved space where breath had become too shallow. And sometimes, as he scribbled his name beneath a story about a future house with chickens and a real stove, he wondered if anyone out there, somewhere, might read it and know him, not as a tenant, not as a labourer, but as a person. In Edwardian England, the poor rarely travelled far. They died close to where they were born. Their names were carved into local stones, their stories fading with each season. But Walter wrote, and in writing, he planted something, not a crop, not a fortune, but a memory, a record that he had lived, hoped, dreamed. Even if no one ever answered, the letter had been written, and that, for a boy with soil under his nails and no inheritance but silence, was enough. There were winters when the cold was cruel, when the frost clung to eyelashes and turned breath into smoke. But then, there were winters like this one, soaked and sodden, where the rain came in endless sheets, day after day, falling not with fury but with persistence, like sorrow that refused to lift. By the third week of February, the village of Milcombe no longer walked on roads. It sloshed through them, the ruts along the lane filled with water that never drained. Gardens became marshes, and cottages, especially those like the Tillings, low and old, grew damp in every seam. Inside the cottage, the corners darkened with mildew, and the hearth never seemed to fully dry the air. Walter awoke most mornings to the steady patter on the thatch, the low drip of water along the wall near the pantry. The roof had begun to give slightly, a line of dark staining spreading like a bruise across the ceiling. Their boots never dried. Their coats steamed when hung near the fire, and the smell of wet wool and wood smoke clung to every corner of their small home. It was not dramatic, this misery. That was the worst part of it. The rain brought no storm, no violence, just the slow erosion of comfort, of patience, of will. In the fields, water pooled at the roots. Seeds, hastily sown in a hopeful early thaw, rotted before they could sprout. The goat paddock was ankle-deep in mud, and the hens, miserable and wet, stopped laying altogether. "Spring's late," Walter's father muttered, again and again, but they all knew it wasn't just late, it was hiding. Every day Walter slogged through muck to chop kindling or patch the gate. His hands ached from the cold damp that settled into his joints. The tools rusted more quickly. Everything did, and then the mould arrived. It came first to the corner where May's old cot once stood, spreading in soft grey patches that grew darker and denser with each day of unchecked rain. Then it crept beneath the cupboard, lifting the boards, curling the edges of books and letters tucked away in drawers. Even their mother's prayer book, kept near the hearth, began to warp. Walter tried to fight it. He boiled vinegar with water and scrubbed the stone with rags, coughing from the fumes, rubbing his eyes with red-stained fingers. But still, the damp returned. May's cough worsened again, soft but ever present. She shivered even when wrapped in 2 blankets, her face paler, her breath thinner. "It's the air," Walter said one night. "It's not the cold, it's the wet." His father didn't answer. He was staring at the fire, jaw tight. They had no medicine left, no coin to fetch more. The doctor hadn't come through the village in over a month, and they hadn't the means to travel to Midhurst. So they did what they always did. They waited. The rain blurred the world beyond their windows. The trees became shadows, the lane a river of mud. Each day passed like the last. Grey light, wet air, tired limbs. Once, when the rain paused for an hour, Walter stepped outside to walk the boundary of their plot. He found the garden patch submerged, the compost heap sagging like a collapsed lung. A bird called out from somewhere unseen, but the sound was lonely, not cheerful. He stood in the rain again the next day, not because there was work to do, but because he needed to breathe outside walls that felt too small. He looked up at the sky, felt the droplets run down his cheeks, and did not move. Behind him, the cottage sagged ever so slightly into the soaked earth. That evening, May asked him why the rain wouldn't stop. "I think it forgets how," he answered. And she laughed, a tired, gentle sound, but a laugh nonetheless. They played a game that night, one their mother had taught them. "What would you do with one dry day?" "I'd sit on the roof," May said. "I'd dry every pair of socks we have. I'd chase the hens across the yard and let them dry their wings." Walter thought for a moment. "I'd lie in the field, just lie there, and smell the grass. You'd get muddy. I wouldn't mind." The next morning, the rain was lighter. By midday, it had stopped entirely, and for the first time in weeks, the sun, weak and watery, like a memory of warmth, broke through the clouds. Walter stepped outside, boots sinking in soaked soil, and tilted his head toward the sky. The air still smelled of mold, of damp stone and wet wood. But above it all, faint but certain, was the scent of soil beginning to breathe again. He didn't smile, but something in him relaxed. He walked the garden again. The damage was worse than he'd hoped, but not total. Some green remained beneath, the straw. That night, he opened the drawer where his letters were kept. Many were curled and spotted with moisture, ink running at the corners. He picked one, an old one, and rewrote it by candlelight. It was a letter about spring, about the first dry day, about the hope that comes not in bursts, but in slow, seeping moments, like a sunbeam that lingers just long enough to be noticed. Because in Edwardian England, the rain didn't just soak your clothes, it soaked your spirit. And surviving the wet was not about endurance alone. It was about believing, against all odds, that it would one day stop. And when it did, even for an hour, that hour was enough to begin again. It was just after the first clear morning in weeks that Mr. Orton arrived at the cottage with a note. Walter was hauling sodden straw from the goat pen when he saw the steward approaching along the lane. His coat crisp, boots clean, despite the mud, and his leather satchel tucked precisely beneath one arm. He handed the folded paper to Walter's father without preamble. "Lord Ainsley is seeking 2 hands to assist with fence repairs on the northern ridge," he said. "Payment in coin, 1 day's work, 3 shillings. You'll need to bring your own tools." His father read the note silently, then nodded. "We'll be there." Orton offered no pleasantry, simply turned and walked back toward the manor. But next morning, Walter rose before dawn. He sharpened the mattock, checked the hammer, gathered nails into a cloth pouch. The tools were worn, the heads rusted, the handles splintered from years of mending. But they would serve. His father packed a crust of bread and a strip of dried meat wrapped in old newspaper. "No time for stew," he muttered. "Eat while you work." They set off in silence, boots squelching through soft earth. The air still held moisture, but the sky had cleared. Gulls circled in the distance, drawn inland by flooded fields. The northern ridge was 3 miles off, near the border of the Ainsley, land and the forest beyond. When they arrived, the estate foreman waved them toward the fence line, a crooked stretch of split posts, sagging from years of rot. There were others already at work. 4 men Walter knew by sight, all tenant labourers. Like themselves, they nodded grimly, exchanging tools and glances. No one asked questions. There wasn't time. Walter began prying up the old posts, hands quickly numbing. The wet ground clung to the wood like sorrow. Nails bent easily, and splinters sliced skin. By mid-morning, he'd soaked through his sleeves and cracked his thumbnail on a knot of oak. They worked through the pain. There was no point in complaint. The foreman said little, pacing up and down the fence line like a sergeant, barking now and then about angle or depth. "Set it straight, or I'll have you redo it." Walter gritted his teeth and drove the stake, harder. The hours passed in labour measured not by clocks, but by aches. Shoulders pulled, backs stiffened, hands bled. At noon, they sat for a brief meal, eating on their feet, leaning against a tree that wept with rain from the night before. The bread was hard, the meat dry, but it was food. One of the other men, Tom Lister, looked down at his fingers, red and swollen. 3 shillings, he muttered. "That's 1 candle, 2 eggs, and a jug of oil if you don't spend it on thread." Walter glanced at him. "Still better than no shillings." "Aye," Tom said, "but only just." When the sun began to drop low behind the trees, the foreman gathered them. "Work's done for now. See the steward tomorrow for pay." They trudged home without words, mud-caked, blistered, exhausted. At the cottage, May greeted them with steaming water for their hands and a basin of broth. Walter winced as he flexed his fingers. His palm was torn where a nail had slipped. His father sank into the old chair by the hearth, silent, staring into the fire as if it owed him something. The next day, they walked to the estate office. Mr. Orton stood at his ledger, a scale beside him, counting coins with precision. 3 shillings, he said, without looking up. "Be sure you sign." Walter's father pressed his thumb against the ink pad and marked the page. The coins were heavy in hand, yet somehow too light to feel like reward. Back at the cottage, they laid the money on the table. It was the first they'd seen in weeks. 3 shillings. Enough for flour, oil, maybe a piece of bacon. Not enough for repairs. Not enough for boots. Certainly, not enough for rest. Walter stared at the coins, then at his hands. The blister had burst during sleep, and now his palm throbbed with dull ache. "Do you ever feel," he asked quietly, "that no matter how much you work, it won't matter?" His father didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Work is the only thing they'll take from us, so we give it, because we've nothing else left to trade." It wasn't despair in his voice, just fact. Walter nodded slowly. He would work again, of course. He would rise before light, drive stakes, haul stone, mend fence. He would do it not for reward, but because it was what kept them here. Kept them fed, if not full. Kept the roof over their heads, if not dry. In Edwardian England, the poor laboured not for ambition, but to avoid the edge of ruin. A day's wage did not build. It bought time, another week, another meal, another coin for salt. And in this way, they lived. By coin, by callous, by quiet surrender to the rhythm of survival. There was a time when the hearth had been the heart of the home. Walter remembered how, in his younger years, it had flickered with laughter. When his mother hummed old folk songs while stirring stew, when May recited rhymes as she warmed her, toes by the coals, when even his father had softened into stories, his voice deep but warm, like bread taken fresh from the oven. But now the hearth had become something else, a place of duty, a flicker of flame not to comfort, but to conserve. Each log measured, each ember stretched. Conversation, like firewood, had become too precious to waste. They no longer sat around it as they once had. They stood, they stirred, they shifted, but rarely lingered. The hearth still burned, yes, but its light no longer drew them in. It illuminated only what needed doing. One evening, after a day spent digging channels to drain standing water from the goat yard, Walter noticed a long crack running up the stone wall above the hearth. It wasn't new, but it was longer. He traced it absently with his eyes as the fire sputtered low, a fine thread of darkness reaching toward the ceiling like a question that had gone unanswered for too long. May noticed too. "Is it safe?" she asked softly. Walter nodded. It's held this long. That was the way of things. Everything held until it didn't. Their father said little in those days. He had grown quieter with the weeks, not cruel, not absent, but carved inward, like a tree bent by years of wind. He spoke only when needed. Fetch more water. Watch that fence. Boil the oats longer. His words were blunt tools. And yet, Walter could see the weight in his shoulders, the tiredness behind his eyes. The silence wasn't avoidance. It was exhaustion. They were all tired. One night, after May had gone to bed, Walter sat by the hearth, longer than usual. He watched the embers crackle, casting red onto the walls. His father sat opposite, nursing a tin mug of weak tea. "Do you ever think," Walter asked quietly, "about what it was like before?" His father looked up. "Before what?" "Before things got so thin, so still." The old man was quiet for a while. Then he said, "There were always lean times, but there used to be more of us, and that made the work feel lighter." "More of us?" "Your mother, the neighbours, the lads who've gone to the city. We may not have had more food, but we had more voices." Walter nodded slowly. "I think that's what I miss," his father continued. "The sound of people. The old days when someone stopped by with eggs or just news. Now it's all hush." Walter stared into the fire. "Why did it stop?" "Because the cold got in," his father said. "Not just outside, in here." He tapped his chest. The fire hissed gently. After a while, Walter asked, "Do you regret staying?" His father didn't look at him. "I regret believing I had a choice." It was not said with bitterness. It was simply truth. And in it, Walter heard the echo of his own fears, that life might be a path with no fork, no turn, only the slow wear of boots on the same stretch of earth. May, even in her youth, had started to carry the quiet. She asked fewer questions, played fewer games. Her cough was better, but her laughter was rare. Sometimes she'd sit with Beatrice, her one-eyed doll, and speak softly to it, not in play, but in whispers that sounded too much like prayer. Walter began leaving his letters on the mantel. He no longer folded them into the drawer. He didn't expect them to be read, but it felt like a way of filling the silence, of leaving something said, even if unheard. One morning, he found May reading one. "This one says you want to build a house by the sea," she said, eyes bright, despite the grey sky outside. "I do," he replied. "Can I come?" "You'd be the first I'd bring." She smiled. That evening, as the fire burned low, May brought her slate to the hearth and sat beside Walter. She drew a picture, crooked but clear, of a little cottage by the shore, smoke from the chimney, a boat by the rocks. He didn't say anything, just looked at it for a long time. Their father watched them both, then stood slowly and fetched another log, one of the good ones, dry and thick. He placed it on the fire without a word. The flame leapt, bright and sharp, and in that moment, something shifted. No grand gesture, no speech, just a small, quiet allowance. That warmth, like words, need not be hoarded forever. In Edwardian England, silence was often a language of survival, but it was also a wall. And sometimes, the bravest thing a family could do was open the door, even just a crack, and let a voice through. That night, they all sat by the hearth again. The crack in the stone remained, but the room felt less broken, and the fire, for the first time in weeks, burned a little brighter. The notice went up on the village board just after the frost lifted. Hiring fair, Stotfold Green, 5th of April. Labourers, carters, dairy hands and gardeners sought wages. Negotiable, meals by agreement, contracts. 6 months, Walter read it twice before the words made sense. A hiring fair. The first in over a year. His father said nothing when he brought the news home, only grunted and returned to sharpening the scythe. May asked, Are you going? Walter hesitated. Maybe. The fair was a chance. A small one, but real. Each spring, farmers and landowners from across the district would gather to hire hands for the coming season. Most who came brought hope tucked into the creases of their coats. Boys seeking change, men seeking coin, widows seeking placements as cooks or housemaids. For a day, Stotfold Green became something else. Not just a patch of trodden grass, but a place where futures pivoted. And it came at a time when Walter felt the weight of his own standing still. He prepared as best he could. He cleaned his boots, polished the buckles on his old coat, and borrowed a collar from Mr. Lindell, the schoolmaster, who said it had once belonged to his nephew. Make sure you speak clearly, Lindell advised. Look in the eye, but not too long. Employers like confidence, not challenge. Walter nodded. He walked to the fair on foot, setting off before dawn, with the sun barely gilding the tops of the trees. The road was soft but passable, and the birds, startled from hedgerows, called after him like questions he could not answer. When he arrived at Stotfold, the green was already stirring. Carts lined the edge. Their contents varied. Tools, trunks, a hen in a crate. Men in coats stood beside signs scrawled with chalk. Dairyman, honest, willing, seeks carting work, 5 years experience. Boy, quick hands, clean writing. Walter stood for a moment, unsure where to go. Then he walked to the end of the green, where a group of estate men were standing. He recognized one of them, a foreman from Broadmoor Farm. The man was tall, his hands folded behind his back, eyes scanning the gathering like a hawk. Walter waited until he caught his attention. You work land? The man asked. Yes, sir. Where? Tilling family. Lord Ainsley's West Fields. 4 years. You drive? A cart, yes. 2-horse team. Field and road. Can you milk? I can. Letters? I can read and write, some. The man looked him over. Room and board. 4 shillings a week. Start in 2 days. It was more than they earned at home. Walter opened his mouth, then closed it. May I ask, can I send for my sister? She's young but quick. She could help with the kitchen. No children. Not for housework. The man turned to speak to another behind him, and just like that, it was gone. Walter walked away, the green spinning slightly around him. Other offers came, or almost did. One man asked if he'd travel to Kent. Another mentioned needing a lad for a stable, but wanted him to sleep in the hayloft. One promised better pay, but only for 6-day weeks, sunrise to nightfall. None mentioned room for family. None mentioned permanence. By noon, the sun had broken through, and with it came dust and disappointment. Walter sat near the edge of the fair, beside the stone marker. Around him, the crowd thinned. Some walked away with papers in hand, some with shoulders heavier. He pulled out one of his letters. It was short, written days earlier, meant for no one. If I leave, will I take the rain with me? Or will it find its own way north? He folded it and placed it in his coat. Then he stood, brushed off his trousers, and began the walk back to Milcombe. When he arrived, May was waiting at the gate. Well? He shook his head. I thought maybe you'd be gone already, she said. Not yet. Inside, his father sat by the hearth, oiling the blade of an old axe. Walter placed his coat on the hook, sat down, and stared into the fire. I almost took 1, he said. 4 shillings. Meals. Field work. His father nodded. No room for May. Another nod. I don't know if I did the right thing. There was a long pause. You came back, the old man said at last. There's no shame in returning, but no progress either, Walter said softly. The wind shifted outside. A door rattled on its hinge. That night, Walter took one of the older letters and tossed it into the fire. It curled, blackened, then crumbled. He watched it burn, then took out another, folded it, and placed it in his pocket. Because in Edwardian England, even a hiring fare was not a promise. It was a mirror. It showed you how others saw your worth and how little room they had for what you could not leave behind. And for a boy who still had roots in the soil and ties too dear to break, even opportunity came at a cost he could not pay. The morning he was gone, the house did not notice. The hearth still smoked quietly, the goats still bleated for feed, the hens still pecked at the hardened ground. But the chair was empty. And for Walter, that was all it took for the day to feel entirely unfamiliar. It was his father's chair. No one else ever sat in it, not even guests, not that they had many. It was a plain, creaking thing, made of oak, its seat worn to a hollow, its arms polished by years of elbows and worry. It had always been in the same place. To the right of the hearth, close enough to feel the heat, but not so near that the fire would lick at the boots stretched before it. But now, it was only a shape. Walter stood staring at it for a long moment. There was no coat on the hook, no boots by the door. The axe was missing from the shed. He didn't panic. There was no note, no sign of struggle, just an absence that carried its own certainty. "He's left," Walter said, aloud. May looked up from the little table where she was folding rags. "For good?" Walter didn't answer. Not yet. By midday, it was clear. He wasn't at the field, not at the cart path, not by the boundary hedge where he sometimes walked. He had left without speaking a word, without even the sound of a door. The day passed like fog, cold and close. That night, Walter cooked supper. He laid out 3 bowls, then quietly removed one. May didn't ask why. She simply ate slowly, chewing longer than needed, as if hoping time might bring him back before the broth turned cold. He didn't return the next morning, or the next. On the 3rd day, Walter found a scrap of paper wedged between the chimney bricks. His father's handwriting, spare and slow, like his speech. "I've given all I can, son. There's work near Oxford. They'll take a man without questions. Don't let May think it's her fault. And don't wait for me. You've more in you than this place allows. Tell the land goodbye for me." That was all. Walter folded the note once, then again, then slid it into the drawer with the others, the letters he never sent. He didn't weep. There was no shock, only the dull echo of something expected finally arriving. That evening, the wind changed. It came down from the hills with the smell of thawing stone and sheep dung. Walter sat on the stool instead of the chair. He chopped kindling with the blunt axe. He boiled oats, then tucked May into bed. When she asked if he thought their father was warm wherever he was, Walter lied gently. "Yes, I think he's inside, not out on the road." She nodded. That was enough. But for Walter, the question didn't matter. Warm or cold, far or near, it changed nothing. The chair remained empty, the hearth crackled, the goat fed, the mud thickened outside the door. And still, they continued. In the days that followed, Walter did everything twice, his work and his father's. He sharpened tools. He watched the sky. He walked the field boundaries and ran his fingers along fence rails for loose nails. There were things missing he hadn't realized his father had always done. Things small but vital, tying sacks just right, turning the compost to keep it breathing, humming, even out of tune, when sharpening the blade. The silence he left behind was louder than any word. Neighbours came by. Mrs. Trundle brought a jar of beans. Mr. Hemley offered extra kindling. But no one asked where the old man had gone. In the village, absence was understood. It required no explanation. Walter began reading aloud at night. Not to May, though she listened, but to the room itself, as if the air had earned a voice. He read from the prayer book, then from his own letters. One night, he unfolded a piece written long ago. "If I ever leave this place, it won't be with a bag or boots, but with my name still spoken softly in the rooms I love." He read it aloud, then folded it again, then placed it on the seat of the empty chair. May noticed, but said nothing. The next evening, she left a drawing there, a picture of their father, crude but recognizably him, holding a spade, standing beneath a tree. Walter let it rest there for 2 days, before moving it to the shelf above the fire. They never moved the chair, they never filled it. It stayed there, as it had always been, but now it meant something different. Not vacancy, but memory. Not abandonment, but an unfinished sentence. In Edwardian England, men often left. The city called, the war called, desperation called louder than kin. But their leaving was not always betrayal. Sometimes it was all they could do not to shatter where they stood. Walter understood that now. He didn't forgive everything, but he understood. And in understanding, something inside him softened. He still woke early. He still worked the land. But now, before bed, he sat for a moment in silence, looked at the chair and whispered, "Good night." Not every night. Just enough. Because in that empty chair, he saw not what was lost, but what was carried, what was tried, what was endured, and that, somehow, felt like enough.